So, dear audience, in this crowded hall, and there's still people entering, but please take your time to be seated very comfortably. We're very pleased to see so many people in front of us. But we're mostly pleased to have these distinguished guests, the ambassadors of France and Germany, Mr. Louis Vassy. Nice to meet you also finally today, and of course that you're here. And Mr. Brengelmann, very nice to see you as well. It's of course very nice also to see the two of you on a stage together here in Utrecht, but it's in fact not the first time that you cooperate, that you work together. You're quite a team, you could say, which is an interesting thing to see as a Dutch guy. But for instance, because earlier this year in April you published a letter, an open letter to the Dutch citizenry, so to us all, in which you called upon us to take a little bit of a step more towards Europe, I would say, in my diplomatic way. And we are very eager to promote this and to stage a public discussion on the future of Europe with the two of you. So we're really honored that you prepared to come here. And because it's two very extremely distinguished guests of Europe, of two European countries that are very, very close to the heart of Europe, to core Europe, which have proven many times in history that they can give Europe an extra push at the moments that it's needed. There's a lot that ties also our three countries together, I think. We're all three founding members of the EU. I think we also are among those countries of the EU that have profited most of European integration. So this is a very Dutch calculus to make, of course, but I think this makes us happy as Dutch. And there's also, on the other hand, an age-old uncertainty in the Netherlands when we see France and Germany cooperate very closely. So there's two sides to the story. Please, Marloes. My name is Jacob Pekelder, and this is Marloes Beers. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So I have the honor to welcome, you had the honor to welcome our guest. I have the honor to welcome our public. And this is the public here, and it's also the public at home. And, well, I see many students, and as a matter of fact, there are many students from our Department of History, students from the MA, International Relations in Historical Perspective, from the minor, International Relations, and from our specialization, Europe in the World. I recognized already several students, and a number of you already told me that this was such an exceptional event, because in fact it's a face-to-face event. It's like in the old days when there was no virus, no pandemic, and we can actually be here with so many people. This is also an exceptional event because we expect from you to engage in a very lively debate today, or discussion, also at home. And it will be a discussion about what Europe needs to survive in crises like in COVID.
Yes, indeed, because indeed the largest part of the evening will be committed or dedicated to a question and answer kind of debate. And we look very much forward to that. Before we go into that, we have a short introduction by both ambassadors. First by Mr. Brengelmann. Oh, no, sorry, they'll do it in a kind of joint performance, as the team they are, of course. After that, we have a short introduction into the question and answer session, and then I'll come back to that. And after that, the floor is entirely yours, of course, with them answering, certainly. But it's up to you to come up with great questions.
And the Q&A will be realized by our MA student Sigrid Stetten, who is sitting there behind the desk, behind the computer, and she will see all your questions on her computer.
Exactly. So how can you pose a question? Well, everybody received, or most of you received a kind of Q&R code on a sheet of paper on your chair or next to the chair or when you entered. And otherwise, you can simply type in the link on your mobile phone. And it's very simple. All you have to do to go to the link there, you're entering the world of Google Docs then, and or Google Forms better, and then you can type in your name and your question. It's very simple and it's very open and transparent. And Palus, when can they start?
Yeah, well, that's very important. So you don't have to wait until the beginning of the discussion. You can already send questions the moment they pop in your head, and then they will appear on the interface of Sigrid.
Yeah, we don't want you to get a headache because you want to memorize your question and you can't already drop it somewhere. So please drop it the instant that you get it. So, lieber Herr Brengelmann, es freut mich sehr, dass Sie nun zum zweiten Mal dieses Jahr schon für meine und unsere Studenten da sind. Das finde ich sehr schön. Ich denke, viel muss ich zur Einführung Ihrer Person nicht sagen, aber ich will doch gerne etwas sagen. Also, you are a very experienced diplomat, with stations, amongst others, in Washington, in Brussels, also in Brasilia. And you have especially gathered experience in the big area of security studies, studies, that's the academic talking, in security and foreign affairs, of course, the foreign ministry in Berlin itself, but also in NATO circles at several stages in your career. That's why I like these cards. We in the Netherlands, your station since 2016, have learned that you're a very open-minded individual, not afraid to speak your mind and to challenge the audience. You, for instance, warned us more than once to improve our skills to talk and do business in the beautiful language of German. And I fully subscribe to that, of course. And I think all my students will in a few years as well. And not so long ago, you had the courage to call one of our parliamentarians a wolf in sheep's clothing, for which you can have a compliment totally on my personal opinion, of course, but as well. So we're in for a treat tonight, I think.
Yeah, and I have the honor to present Mr. Louis Vassy, who has wide experience in diplomatic affairs, both at the embassy in Washington and as a diplomatic advisor at the highest level in Paris. Just before Monsieur Vassy became ambassador in the Netherlands, and that's exactly 1 year ago, he was chef de cabinet of Jean-Yves Le Drian, who became the Minister of Europe in Foreign Affairs in France. Of course. There's a little anecdote, a little interesting thing to know about Mr. Vassy. He's well known in the embassy as having a very good talent in languages, and apparently he already speaks Dutch. But he just asked me if I please wouldn't say this to you, and so please ask him the questions in English, or in French. I think that would be. But I'm not sure if Sigrid would be happy with that. So please in English. Donc, c'est pour moi un immense honneur et plaisir de vous présenter Son Excellence, Monsieur Vassy, ambassadeur de la France.
Oké, klein applausje zou ik zeggen. And I think Mr. Brengelmann would start, so please, and we will be seated.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us over, thanks to the university. And I realize that with your program, I visited some time ago, and with Professor de Graaf, the context with this university are already pretty manifold. So thanks to you, the university, our embassy teams, and the Genootschap for setting up this event tonight. I will start by just highlighting one particular point for my country at this point of time, which is that since 1st of July, Germany is having the so-called presidency of the Council of the European Union. Nowadays, that's perhaps not so important anymore than it used to be many years ago, because now we have a president of the European Council, we have the European Commission, etc. But it's still important in terms of making sure that you try to forge compromises, that you are, so to say, the honest broker. So during the time of the presidency, it is a little bit more difficult for a country to just follow your own national interests. The Dutch have experienced that in 2016, and I know the French will have it from 1st of January 22. So that is a special moment. When we prepared for the presidency, there was no COVID yet. So you can imagine we had set up a full blossom program of great ideas. COVID brought some of that actually down to the level of sober reflection, and we had to reduce it to more essential points. So when we started on the 1st of July, what really was in our mind was to safeguard the function of the European Union and its institutions and its well-being during a pandemic. And as many of you would argue, perhaps we were not starting that well on that front when it happened in March. So we needed to turn around. Then the other point we reflected upon was to find solutions to the most pressing issues. Number one, how can we organize the recovery of the European countries after the pandemic or even during the pandemic? Brexit, we have to deal with the Brexit, which is looming, and we need to find a solution real quick. If we want to find a solution. And last not least, the eternal issue, if I may, to make Europe fit for the future, while still working on a recovery with a pandemic. So what we tried to work out also during the recovery discussion, how can we make sure that some of the funds and resources the European Union has available we put into the Green Deal, we put into digitalization to make sure that Europe as such is fit for the future. And last not least, the other point which is always looming large on our agenda is the international role of the European Union, because like it or not, with growing international tensions and other players like China coming more stronger, we need to make sure that Europe is not lost, so to say. Unfortunately, as we speak here, the numbers of corona are increasing all over Europe. So my very dear personal hope is that we will not come to a point again where we are closing down borders on each other. By the way, the border between our two countries was never closed. And that we can continue to make sure that all these goals can be achieved. Will not be easy, but we'll try our best. My French colleague will now go a little bit more into the issue of how Germany and France together came to propose something which then actually was the main topic for the European Council in July, and I'll be coming back on something else after that. So it's now for my French colleague.
Okay, so it's my turn to thank you all for being here, and I'm of course extremely pleased to see that despite the challenges of the pandemic, we are actually able to pursue a kind of normal life by resuming this kind of interactions. And I think, by the way, that we are also learning a lot in how to work from a distance, how to do events that are both with physical presence and online, and seeing that we are that our capacity to adapt to these challenges is very real. As Dirk said, he said a lot about the substance and where the German presidency is. I would like simply to underline a couple of methodology points in a way. If we have been able at the moment of COVID, when COVID came to us in a way, in a very extremely quick manner. I mean, if you look back to the month of March, you recall that on February, end of February, beginning of March, you recall that almost every day was bringing news about closing more things, more restrictions, and the pace of the progression of the epidemic. And of course, the fact that it was extremely new, that we didn't know exactly what was at stake, etc., meant a lot of uncertainty and huge challenges for all of us. If we were able to react in a way so quickly, of course, not everything was perfect, and we might go back to that, but overall, I think, and that was also the sense of the message we sent in the spring, overall, Europeans have been able to show that with their open institution, democratic system, and value sets, we were still able, through cooperation, to actually achieve quite significant results. And at the time, we were not yet working on what became the recovery package of July 21st. But I think it's fair to say that if we have come there so quickly, I mean, frankly, from March to July, it's pretty amazing in a way to be able to develop such a recovery program in such a short time frame. It's because we had been doing lots of thinking beforehand on the state of world affairs and what it meant for the European Union. For us, the French, a lot, of course, has to do with the election of the president. It is fair to say that he was elected specifically on a pro-European platform, so with the idea that, of course, France, as any member state, shall not dissolve in the European Union, but he introduced this concept of European sovereignty, which is important to understand, is simply the statement, the obvious statement, by the way, that if we want to hold control of our destinies, there are things that we cannot deal only as individual states in an isolated fashion. And it's true even for larger states like France, and even for even larger states like Germany. When you talk about trade, when you talk about digital issues, when you talk, of course, about climate change, environment, energy transition, these are issues that need, of course, when you talk about borders and migration, these are, of course, issues that need to be dealt collectively. And dealing with them collectively is not reducing your sovereignty, it's actually increasing your ability to control your destiny, which is actually the very definition of being sovereign. That diagnosis was posed in a way very strongly in a speech by President Macron in September 2017 in Sorbonne. And from there, I think he acknowledged that we needed to work specifically with Germany because of the traction capacity that the French-German relation brings to the European Union, we believe, but also with all member states. And I think it's very significant that French authorities, as German authorities do, have been working with all member states on these issues, including with the Netherlands, and we might come back to that in the Q&A. That produced in 2018 and 2019 a series of French-German meetings, documents, where we were able to actually come together to a series of concepts, including enshrining the concept of European autonomy that we see with pleasure used more and more by all diplomatic networks, but also European sovereignty, which is enshrined in the Meseberg Declaration of 2018. And then specifically the French-German relation is, of course, deepened through the Aachen Treaty, and with, of course, some aspects in terms of foreign policy, but also cross-border cooperation between European regions. So you take everything from the local level to the pretty global level, down to also the Toulouse meeting by our two leaders, where they specifically evoked space industry and cooperation in these sensitive areas. And again in Brégançon in August, where France and Germany, in the context of the Recovery Fund, envisage areas of cooperation that have to do with hydrogen, digital, of course, space and space cooperation specifically. So, as Dirk said, to prepare ourselves for the future. Why did we do that even before COVID? I think it has a lot to do with the international context in which we are. I think it is fair to say that Europeans need to acknowledge the fact that they need to rely on themselves more and more. Of course, there is a specific dynamic that is linked to the current US administration, but I think we also need to acknowledge that it's a deeper trend in the US to look at other challenges. I mean, we all remember that the previous Obama administration was evoking the necessity to pivot towards Asia, and that should be, in a way, something that the Europeans need to consider when looking at their strategic environment. And of course, we need also to acknowledge that we have specific challenges that arise from a more assertive China, including in the economic and security terms, and some of our neighbors that also tend to exert, let's say, to put it mildly, some pressure on us, namely the Russians, but also Turkey. So if you look at all that, I think it is fair to say that Europeans need to stick together in a way and look at how to reinforce themselves through cooperation. Of course, each member state needs to do its part in reinforcing itself, but there is value added to cooperation. And I think that's another, maybe the last point I would like to make in terms of French-German methodology, which is that, and I think in a way we do that here at our modest individual level, we are Europeans, and certainly French-German in particular, we are the embodiment in a way that a world regulated by cooperation and compromise is actually possible and brings positive results to the ones that participate in that endeavor. That is, in fact, something we've seen with the recovery plan. I mean, we came from very, very different points of view in this negotiation, and through compromise, we were able to get to a result that would accommodate everyone's constraint in a way. That's what the European Union is about, and we need to understand that it's a grammar that is less and less present in the world stage, and simply making it live within the European Union as in itself an illustration power that we need to maintain. And that's why, that would be simply my conclusion, we have been also, outside of the European Union, extremely active in defending multilateralism as a way of working, and that's why our two foreign ministers, Jean-Yves Le Drian and Heiko Maas, are co-chairing, co-leading the Alliance for Multilateralism, which is a group of now around 60 countries that reassert their willingness to participate in a constructive multilateral system, which is challenged by those that want to break it, those that want to create an alternative multilateral system. And together, we think we have a role, with, of course, the whole of the European Union, to illustrate the fact that multilateralism and the spirit of cooperation and compromise can actually bring positive things to those that participate in it.
Yes, that was actually the point I want. So I will try to just to two or three more little things, which is when you look around us, Louis was just speaking about Europe's ability to act together in terms of the European sovereignty, which then would include issues of foreign policy and defense policy. You could also look at trade and industry, where now with the COVID crisis, there's talk about making sure that certain elements of health can be provided also here, that the supply chains are being relooked at. That doesn't mean to go deglobalization, but to make sure that we have our own interests perhaps more strongly in focus. When you look at the problems around us, just around us, there are numerous ones right now. You have Belarus, we are discussing that every day. You have Russia, which had, as you know, that has been in the news a lot lately, where we have a strong suspicion that there was how do you call that, a toxic attack on Mr. Navalny. So we are looking into that. You have the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean, where you have problems between Greece and Turkey and Cyprus and Turkey. And I'm not talking about the old ones like Iran, Caucasus, and what else. On top of that, far away, and Louis mentioned that, a more assertive China. And you can see our American allies asking us more and more to choose sides in certain issues, be it 5G, why, be it trade issues, etc. And the European Union has become more clear in its messaging vis-à-vis China. At the last video conference between EU leaders and the Chinese leadership, there was a pretty clear language, I understand. But still, we want to engage and not just cut off because somebody thinks we should cut off. So we don't want, you might put it that way, just simply choose sides for the argument of it. We want to be clear in our own mind that we have our European interests in mind. Louis mentioned the Alliance for Multilateralism, and yes, especially in the city of The Hague, and we are not far away from it, the city of peace and security, it is important to see this multilateral cooperation working for the International Criminal Court, but also all other courts. If we don't work together, then we run the risk of being taken apart. Then we are not actually players, but as somebody else termed it, a playing field if we don't care. I think when you look at the European Union and its possibility to act also outside and to act as a foreign policy player, yes, there are problems. You could see it in the news today. Foreign ministers wanted to actually decide on sanctions vis-à-vis Belarus, but there was another issue which was in the way in one country, which is of the view that you can only do sanctions vis-à-vis Belarus if you do sanctions at the same time vis-à-vis Turkey. That's not our view, but that's part and parcel of European debates. And therefore, and I think we're also of the same view, where if we want to make foreign policy more efficient, we need to see how we can overcome that hurdle of unanimity, which is there on each and every issue, and which from time to time blocks our ability to act, and that is a problem then. I think with this, we probably would like to stop and give it to the audience.
It's so cozy here that I forget I have a mic. Thank you very much for this expose, and three exposés, but very interesting. What I found also interesting was on both sides, or of your mutual side, the language you're using, that we in the Netherlands don't so often see. I don't want a direct reaction of you about it, but you talking about, for instance, posing the question to the Europeans, also to the Dutch, would you rather be a player or would you rather be playing field for other players? Or the language you talked about, methodology of multilateralism, for instance, and of working together, maybe starting with 2 countries and spreading, let's say, the good work over more countries after some time. Also talking about a grammar that we have to try to learn to speak a bit more maybe, that these are metaphors and methods that are not so registered in the Netherlands. So it's interesting if we could try to introduce them some more, because I think it makes at least for an interesting debate, and maybe also for a higher level of debate on Europe. So it's interesting. But we've invited Beatrice de Graaf, a professor of international relations here at Utrecht University, to give us a short impetus as the first question. Or first remark, and please, Beatrice. Oh yeah, sorry, there's the mic. Yeah.
Thank you, Sigrid. Thank you so much, Mrs. Ambassadors, Jacco, Marloes, for setting this beautiful initiative up. But I would like to bring some historical realism in the debate, if I may. Because some public administration scholars, together with us historians, conducted research, are still conducting research over the last 200 years on the conditions under which transboundary cooperation works or not. So the conditions under which transboundary cooperation in crisis time works. Now, if you consider a pandemic by nature a transboundary crisis, we do need transboundary cooperation. And two of the criteria, we've established 5, but 2 of the criteria are especially interesting, and my question is on those 2 criteria. The first criteria is, over the past 200 years in Europe, transboundary cooperation only worked if the group of countries that pushed cooperation was not too big and not too small. So 4 or 5 countries together, not one, not just Napoleon, not just Merkel, not all of them together, like in 1918. No, 4 or 5. An allied triumvirate, you could say. So how do you feel about that? And could the Netherlands be part of such? So not just the Germans and the French, but a couple of more on top of that. Would the Netherlands be part of that? I could give you historical examples to mark my point. It's serious research, although I'm a little bit presenting it as a provocation, but it's serious research that is 4 or 5 countries at the most. Second criterion is the criterion of enforcement. You do need some kind of leverage in order to make the countries stick to the agreed cooperation. For example, after 1918, there was in Paris l'Office de l'Hygiène Publique. And there was the agreement of all the countries participating in the League of Nations that they would cooperate in terms of fighting pandemics, but they did not because no one enforced it. And only after 45, there was an element of enforcement. So my question to you is, for today's recovery after COVID, how many countries and how can we enforce the cooperation?
Maybe I think first of all that it's extremely, as a general statement, it's extremely important that when we look into issues, including foreign relations, we are able to factor in the results of research, just to make sure that we do not reinvent the wheel all the time, and also because it allows us to, let's say, have a more fact-based approach to policy making. I would simply note, I'm not an historian, of course, but I would simply note a couple of methodological remarks. If you take 200 years, I think within the 200 years, there are some pretty heavily different periods in time. And I think it is fair to acknowledge that the Second World War, in a sense, is a completely different period for Europe than anything before, in the sense that between the beginning of the 19th century and certainly World War I, and to some extent because of inertia until World War II, the Europeans might have thought that they were basically leading world affairs, and so they had the luxury to make war to each other in a very persistent manner. And I think France and Germany have, in that sense, brought their own contribution to that reality. I would argue that after 45, Europeans came to the idea that maybe that wasn't the proper way of dealing with things, and that we are in a pretty different world in which the value of cooperation, peace, stability within the European context has been factored in a more in a deeper way within public opinions and policy making. Having said that, I think it is fair to say that in a way, if I try to simplify the question, which is a very persistent question in European affairs, is about, let's say, different circles or different speeds at which we built the European Union. And of course, it's a very complex issue, including from an institutional standpoint, by the way. And there are always those that want to do more in smaller groups or simply have everyone on board. There are merits to both rezonings. In a way, we are already in a Europe in which countries might adhere or not to certain policies, if only the euro, for example, which is not shared by all EU members or Schengen, or some opt-outs that some countries have. So in a sense, we are already in that methodology. Then we still think, I think in France, and apparently, but Dirk will tell us about Germany, that once you've said that, you still need, if you want to deal with the emerging challenges, a core. I mean, you need someone to take the initiative, let's say. That can come from very different avenues of life. It's not only, I mean, it so happens that the French like grand schemes, and so we tend to have ideas and share them with others. I think we also acknowledge that if there isn't some kind of French-German agreement, it's difficult to move things in the right direction. That doesn't mean, by the way, that we agree on everything. There are issues well known on which we have nuances. But I think that the beauty or the dynamic of the French-German relation is that we are always able to discuss them, try to see where agreement is possible. But even today, I think if you ask me or Dirk about energy policy, we might have different point of views on how to get to a carbon neutral society by 2050. But these are debates that we can have, and there are so. That means that you can have other groups. I mean, it so happened that this year we wrote a couple of joint papers with the Netherlands, for example, on trade, including with the affirmation of the necessity of a carbon adjustment mechanism at the border. And then because we have a level of agreement that is very high with the Netherlands on that particular issue, we moved the debate forward in a French-Dutch context. What's the place of the Netherlands? I think it's also for the Netherlands to decide. I really think that pretty deeply, in the sense that, I tend to believe that as a founding member of the EU, the Netherlands should be in the leading group, let's say, of those that try to craft proposals for how to deal with the next challenges that we are facing. It's public, so I can relay that, but it's been noticed that in the preparation process of the European Summit of July, in several instances, leaders met in what they call the Washington Group, so basically Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands. So in a way there was this kind of group that was really very matter-of-factly the 5 biggest economies of Europe, and also of course had the benefit of having 2 southern countries, 2 northern countries, and one mine somewhere in the middle, to try to see what was the room for compromise. I think that's in that instance a methodology that worked very, very well in the end, and shows that there is actually, more than willingness to have the Netherlands participating in the core process of crafting European compromises.
Yeah, I would only add to this that you're probably right in the sense of whether it's 4 or 5, a group can't be too small. So even the two of us know when we make proposals, this is something we can put forward as a proposal and still then need to negotiate with others. And usually also before we make a proposal, already start a process of consultation with others. 4 or 5, you say, that looks a little bit like a practice also, because Louis just mentioned the Washington group. You have had in the run-up to the European summit and at the European summit, the what you call in Dutch the vrekkige 4 or frugal 4, which in the summit was perhaps even 5. So also there. Then, you know, post-Brexit, the Netherlands was trying what could be a little bit our role, our place in terms of new alliances. There was a strong feeling post-Brexit we need to increase our cooperation with Germany and France, that's clear. And you could see a lot of interaction between Den Haag and Berlin, but also between Den Haag and Paris. But on top of that, there was this clear effort to see who else and what else. You had meetings with the Visegrad 4, you had meetings in other frameworks. Eventually on finance issues, one group became more prominent, which was called the Hanseatic League, more northern countries, framing Germany in a certain sense, you could imagine. You also had, as I just said, the Frugal 4. So the Dutch do have a very strong place in Europe. They are very strong negotiators, you have a strong economy, and given the size of the country, I think the Dutch really have a very important play, and others, not me, but others would actually argue they may even punch above their weight line in terms of influence within the European Union, but it's also part of their professionalism and their strong negotiating power. So they do have a role. When you have a leading role within the European Union, and I come back to what I said about the presidency, the same applies, I think, in a more general sense, when you have a leading role, then from time to time you need to gauge what is my national interest and where is a more overall interest, which I need to look at because I want to have a leading role. And that is something which comes back to people in a leading role from time to time. I mentioned that we face that more often than not. And let me make one point on this, more on this concrete summit preparations which we have had in July. When Germany and France came out with their joint proposal, there were some Dutch who would actually tell me, oh, that is surprising that you, Germany, move, because usually on money you're also where we are. I would argue that when you look at Germany and the role of German governments and chancellors over the last decades, that when push comes to shove, when Europe is in an existential moment, and I think we were in an existential moment, that a European reflex is there. And I think that has been part and parcel of German governments over the past decades. You made one important point about enforcement and leverage. And I think what is important, and I repeat in a sense what Louis just said, we start very often from different approaches when we try to come together. And sometimes I've done that for many years now, and sometimes it can be difficult negotiations. But I think what we always know when we work with each other is that we trust in the commitment of a deal, in the promises which we make to each other when we come to joint ideas and proposals. So there's a certain sense of being serious about it. And then the enforcement, yes, the enforcement can only really take place when you manage to get others convinced of your ideas and get them behind you, because I mentioned that in terms of foreign policy, but it's also true on many other issues. There's still a lot of areas in the European Union where you need the agreement of everybody. So everybody can have his say. And let me put it that way, turn it the other way around. The force of a non, when it is a veto power, is a very strong role. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, please.
Sorry? Yes, sorry. Do you allow me just on enforcement a couple of words, because that's of course a very important issue. Enforcement will depend, I think again, what the European Union has built is a bit specific in terms of the legal system, courts, norms, etc. But you're right, in the end, and that's very strong, that's a key, I think a key building block of what we are doing within the European Union. In the end, we need to trust each other we need to be able to trust each other in the fact that we will abide by the rules that we have set to ourselves. Of course, courts will rule, etc., but it will also come down to what you do at the national level. And in that sense, I have to say that we are all watching very carefully the evolutions within the European Union in terms of rule of law. Because, as very well stated in the Prinsjesdag speech by His Majesty, what is at stake is not only defense of fundamental rights in European countries, it's simply that if we cannot trust each other's legal system, it is the whole system that is weakened. Because simply in the end it will have effects on the internal market. If our jurisdiction cannot recognize each other's decisions, this will have an impact on what we are building as a whole. And there I think we've done much more than what was the case in the 20s, 30s in implementation capacity. But you are right that it is an extremely sensitive point that we need to be very cautious about, because it's really the balance of the whole construct that is at stake when we look at rule of law issues.
Thank you very much. This was a very extensive answer. Beatrice, are you satisfied? Yes, good. That's I would say yes as well. Thank you very much. You touched already on sensitive points just in the beginning of the debate, and I was curious, Sigrid, are there already questions?
Yeah.
Yes? Would you like to take over and read some questions?
Okay, so I got a few questions about the Klingendahl study that was released today. It was actually interesting because we talked about that before. So the Klingendahl study that was released, in which 23,000 Dutch citizens were asked about international relations, 72% of the respondents supported deeper cooperation with France and Germany in light of Brexit and President Trump's America First policies. Do you experience that sentiment as well in your day-to-day working life? And would this deeper cooperation change the current US and Europe relationship? So I got a lot of questions also about how the upcoming elections are going to influence Europe, between America and Europe.
Yeah, as you can imagine, I've seen that study. I've also seen what the Volkskrant and the AD wrote about it. Studies are always an important parameter, but on the other hand, one should always be a little bit careful because the result of studies can also change. So this is not for internal. But it does give me some encouragement in terms of the strong support which is expressed there by people, as it seems, for a good cooperation between the Netherlands and my country and France. And as I said a few moments ago, I think that post-Brexit, we were actually observing that. We have seen more of cooperation, and I think that the same is true for my French colleagues. But I also accept, and I realize that this is a strong feeling, not just in the Netherlands, in that European Union, on many issues, there are divergent interests. So alliances and partnerships are sometimes also shifting in terms of the issue at hand. So on fiscal issues, you may have other friends than when it comes to a certain foreign policy issue, etc., etc. So that's part of our reality. But the overall statement of a strong cooperation with Germany, France is something I appreciate. You mentioned the point of day-to-day cooperation. As I said, yes, we do feel a lot of cooperation, but also, yes, we also sometimes get the reflection, it's very good to have that cooperation, but please give us some balance, give us some space. And when Louis and me wrote that article in AD, we got some reflections about that. And 10 or 15 people actually were asking us, why are you, Germans and French, telling us? So you have all kinds of reactions. You also have that reaction, and we have to live with that. And that's part and parcel of reality. On the US element there, you know, I don't want to use that now to kind of explain a certain level of Schadenfreude or anything like that, because I really believe that's not the point. We are still very much in favor of strong transatlantic ties. It has been somewhat difficult lately, admittedly, on certain issues. Take Iran, where there were problems. Take the recent one, which is of relevance also to this country, the executive order against the International Criminal Court, which is deeply disturbing to us. So there have been issues, but that doesn't mean that we are not convinced still of the importance of strong transatlantic ties. So positive news, this study, and yeah.
So on my side, to make it very short, because it's the same kind of experience, maybe just two examples to exemplify the deepening of the bilateral work that has been going on between France and the Netherlands in the context that we've talked about. I mentioned the joint paper on trade, for example. I think it is very interesting to see, even conceptually, a French-Dutch paper on trade. If you would have told me 10 years ago that there would be one day a French-Dutch paper on trade, I might not have believed it, because we were coming from very, very different point of views in terms of the right balance between openness and protection of our own interests confronted with trade, or the norms that we want to apply to international trade. Of course, we are here in a country with a very strong tradition of free trade. At the same time, I can now have the discussion with people here, either in industry or government, about the fact that maybe our overall free trade policies of the 2000s, by allowing foreign produced solar panels to come at dumping prices, have basically destroyed the European industry in terms of that key capacity for energy transition. So I think there is an evolution, certainly in France, in that regard. But there is also an evolution in the Netherlands about the right balance between openness and, let's say, dealing with our core industrial or intellectual property interests. Another example that is extremely interesting, and I was really happy that we were able to do that, was the deployment of a Dutch frigate in the Gulf region, together with a French naval asset, in a European-led mission to de-escalate the situation in that part of the world. Again, in the context of Brexit, that you know, when you have this initiative by France of a European mission, maybe 10 years ago it would have not been completely obvious to have as first partner in that military mission the Netherlands, but it so happened that the two countries that were on board with actual naval assets were first the Netherlands and second Denmark, which is, by the way, also a very a country that is extremely keen on maintaining strong transatlantic links, which is also the case of France. I think it's important to say that the only thing we say is that we need to acknowledge that sometimes maybe there are instances where the United States will tell us this security issue is for you to handle. And if you realize that you're not able to handle that issue, that might be for us collectively extremely frustrating. And I would say that there has been already a couple of instances where we have discovered that we were pretty limited in our capacity to deal with security challenges, including at our very border. And that's where I think we think collectively, and we see more and more Europeans agreeing with that agenda, that there is value to Europeans getting together to develop capacities and willingness to deal with security issues together.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we simply jump to another question because there's probably a lot more. So Sigrid, please.
Okay, so I got a few questions about the economic plan in response to COVID-19. So I'll just take the one from Lars. So the French-German economic plan on the response to COVID it turned out very different. So initially it was supposed to be a loan of 750 billion euros, and it turns out that Europe agreed on a different plan. So the question is, what do the French and Germans think about this different plan? Are they disappointed, and how was this decision made with a frugal fall?
No, maybe in a nutshell, to understand where we came from. The French-German plan is actually 500 billion euros in grants, and the Commission proposal was that amount plus 250 in loans, and which makes a total amount of 750. And the compromise in the end is 750, of which, that's where there is a difference, 390 are grants, and the rest, 360, are loans. I mean, it's an outstanding compromise. It's a lot of resources. We've been able to pull together our capacities to bring these resources up. It's important to acknowledge that there is a link to a reforms agenda in member states, because we think it is fair to expect that we also take this opportunity to reinforce our economies all over Europe. And I think that's something that was, of course, very important for Germany, and certainly here in this country too. That is there, but also I think what's more important is that it's really something that prepares the future with a strong insistence on digital transformation, and of course the fact that 30% of the total amount needs to be directed towards climate change challenges. So with that in hand, it is our collective responsibility now to make good use of these resources and make sure that we overcome the crisis, the economic crisis that we don't necessarily see very clearly yet, because all of us have been putting strong amounts of money and aid packages to soften the effects in the very short term of the crisis. But it's very important that as soon as possible, beginning of next year, these resources allow us to basically move to the next phase, which is the rebounds of our economies and making sure that we remain at the top of the sectors that are important for innovation and our competitiveness.
Yeah, on this composition of the compromise, I take the same view. When you know where we came from, I think in the end it was a very good compromise. Yes, it were pretty difficult days in terms of the negotiation there in Brussels, but it was productive days. And it was very good that leaders were actually able to meet in presence, physically, and not just by a video conference. This deal was only possible because people were able to deal with each other on a personal basis, go from room to room, meet in different groups. But the deal as such cannot be seen in isolation. We had that, the package, and we had the European budget for the next 7 years together on the table. And so there were pretty momentous decisions which had to be done there. There has been, as I indicated before, some surprise that Germany would move that direction. And as you know, it has always been a debate in Germany on the so-called Eurobonds. This is not Eurobonds, but it is a common commitment to each other. And in that sense, it is an important step, and it was an important step forward in a very decisive moment. As I said before, I don't think we would have gone that far if the moment had not been so special and so important. To be honest with you, there's a different mood with different political parties in Germany on how much of it should be done in the future and where do we stand in political terms. You would have different views for some in the CDU compared to the SPD, but that is part of the political debate back home. All in all, I think we were very satisfied with the outcome of it. And mind you, for us, and especially for our Chancellor, it was very important because it was the first summit under our presidency, and we were not 100% sure we would come out with a decision. And that would have been a scar, so to say, on the European Union and also on our presidency. Just one word on the issue of bilateral cooperation. Maybe two things which even here in the Netherlands are not that well known. We are, Germany is the Netherlands' biggest trading partner. I think that people do know, but that you, the Dutch, are our second biggest trading partner. That is not known everywhere. And I think that is perhaps quite a strong expression of a very strong cooperation. You are our second biggest trading partner in 2018 and 19. And another area where we do have a lot of cooperation is actually the area of defense and security. That's also not that very well known. The Dutch and German units in terms of land forces are very much integrated, 4 levels down. And the truth is also that on all missions within the past years, in some way or the other, we were actually together, be it in Afghanistan, Mali, I think we were together. We are together in the Baltics with this forward endeavor, I think it's called, of NATO. And we were together in the sea operations, not in that one which Louis just mentioned. And I think they are, in all honesty, the Dutch made quite a step, and I personally very much welcome that. Cross-border initiatives, let me only highlight one thing. Yes, we had difficult beginnings in the moment of the corona pandemic. And I was so lucky that we could keep our border open because, mind you, when you go to the border area, how many people live in one country and work in the other, or study in the other country and live with their parents in the other one. On that border, it is thousands, tens of thousands who would have been impacted. And for that, we were very happy that we could keep that going, not just trade, but also people. Now we have yet another situation, and as you know, countries are now looking also to the corona epidemic in terms of figures in different countries. And recently, we had to say that the figures in North and South Holland were too high and consider it in terms of the pandemic as a risk area. That has certain problems when, for example, when you now want to go to Germany, but we can manage. I think this time we will not be running a fool like we did in the first place. Thank you.
There was was interesting to see that people were especially in the border region, but maybe even if I know of some people, even from other parts of the Netherlands, were brought to German hospitals at the moment when there was the acute crisis of having two little IC beds. So that was very remarkable, I think. I think the same happened also in German-French relations. So that was a remarkable piece of European cooperation, I think, at a very acute time, comparable maybe to the 50s when we had a flooding in Zeeland, and there were also millions of worth of rescue goods delivered by all our neighboring countries. So that was remarkable, I think. Yeah. Sorry, it was basically your turn, but let's try to ask Sigrid again. Yes, please.
So an important question maybe, what can the EU do against populism and politicians promoting nationalism and leaving the EU? Because of course that's a widespread problem. How can the EU promote itself and promote European cooperation and integration? What's the best way?
Look, of course, since it's a question that has to do with internal politics, it's something that is necessarily sensitive to handle, because we need to take stock of the state of our public opinions. I mean, we live in democracies, and there are opinions, and there is skepticism towards the European Union. It exists, even towards European cooperation. 2 points maybe. I mean, it is fair to acknowledge that the way Euroscepticism works is in effect self-contradictory sometimes, in the sense that you have countries where, we saw that during the pandemic, by the way, people were saying Europe does not enough, and others were saying Europe wants to do too much. It's a kind of, you don't see the cooperation path that is open there. I think the only thing, since it's a sensitive question, I would say is that, in a way, allow me to make a little detour towards Brexit. What the current situation is showing, the complexity of the negotiation of the Brexit is showing, of the future relations agreement, is that sometimes when you are so intertwined, simple answers might look simple, and in the end, when you try to set them, to implement them, you might realize that they are slightly more complicated than you thought in the beginning. Let's say, to go back to my sovereignty point, you might say, I want to regain my sovereignty and not be dependent on anyone. Are you really in the end more sovereign in this world where you need to cope with China on one hand, the United States on the other, and all these major groups or economies? Are you really more in control of your destiny if you are isolated by yourself? Our point in France is that the answer is no. I mean, I respect all arguments, but I also still acknowledge that the complexity of the Brexit discussion tends to show that there are benefits to participating in the common market, accessing a major economic world as the European Union is, and that coming out of it actually might weaken you in the end.
I might have some additional elements on that from my point of view. All over Europe, we have seen populism rising lately, and but the interesting thing is, in most places, the reasons for that are pretty similar. It's the fear of globalization. What does it mean for me? it is migration issues, and linked to both of these, in many countries you find a debate on identity. So it's not just an economic issue, it's also the issue of cultural identity. So that there are different elements on which populism can thrive, but they are not completely decoupled from each other in different countries. They may have a different impetus, but there's a link. Apart from populism, let me say, in many countries, it has been for many years quite a nice folklore to make Brussels responsible for various things. The huge monster bureaucracy of Brussels was a live topic every year. I can tell you it's the monster bureaucracy of Brussels is equal to the size of the administration of the city of Cologne, just to give you a certain perspective or context. And also, and that is certainly true for my country, but also for the Netherlands, there's some kind of asymmetry in the debate, because quite bluntly, you can calculate the costs of it by the penny, or nowadays we should say by the cent. And so that is easy. You can calculate how much did I have to pay. The benefits we get is more difficult to calculate. But the truth of the matter is that countries like mine and yours, I mean the Netherlands, we have profited very clearly from a Europe of open borders for goods, people, ideas, etc. And we have had decades of peace. And I think one should also not forget that. I'm sometimes being told that for young people, the issue that we have been a continent of peace for so many decades is no longer relevant. Personally, I don't believe it. I think this is a very strong thing to say for the benefit of the European Union. So we have benefited more than perhaps sometimes meets the eye. There's only one last comment I would like to make, which is in some countries you can see that the character of populism towards Europe has been a little bit changing. It's not, with younger people, not always so raw nationalistic. It is more, it is critical, but not completely opposed with some. There are different groups on the populist side. There are also still those who are really raw about their views, but there has been some kind of differentiation in that, and one has to be aware of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these answers to this very difficult and large question with this academics and experts struggle already since years. Well, I just, can I add something? Because I just had an MA student who wrote a thesis about some kind of European populism, which was starting, and was with a European nationalism, calling for European identity. And in that way, it's totally different than a national populism, which could be a threat to EU. Well, Sigrid, I think you have a lot of other questions. I'm not sure. Do we have time for? Because we have to.
We have ample time, so we have about 18 minutes. So
18?
yeah.
18. So if it's a large question, it might be the last one.
We can try to make shorter answers for the last questions.
I have to choose now. Okay, maybe something that's relevant with the speech given by von der Leyen. So how do you feel about this speech, and how realistic is the aim to come out of this pandemic as a stronger and more united Europe?
Yeah, for instance,
Because she happens to be German.
yeah.
She's labeled German Francophile.
She was brought up in Brussels, and when she was elected into that office, she said in some circumstance, I've forgotten where, it's like coming home. She was born and raised in Brussels. because her father was a Director General of the European Commission, later to become Minister President for Niedersachsen, Ernst Albrecht. I've heard partly the speech, I've read it, and I find the impetus, the initiatives good on digitalization, on the Green Deal, which, by the way, Frans Timmermans is the one to work with, so a well-known Dutchman, and also Verstager, which we know from before is still there working on some of the other high-level issues. So it's a strong team. I thought it was a strong proposal, a strong speech. Mind you, with the COVID situation and the implementation, which should help what she said, the implementation of the recovery package once it's gone and through, we should be able to actually implement some of these proposals. I think most ambitious actually was on climate. There was a clear statement on climate. And I think that is good that we have ambitions on that front because we need it. So it's the green, it's the digitalization. And yes, as I said in the beginning, in terms of our presidency, how to make sure that Europe can keep functioning through that pandemic. That are the essential points.
That was a short answer, so very well.
Can we come back stronger? I think it is, of course, possible. We have now all the tools, as I said, when answering the question on Recovery Fund, we have all the tools at hand, the resources, we have the technological capacity, we have the talent, we have the universities, we have everything that one would dream of to come out of the crisis in better shape. One condition for that was unity, and I think it goes back to the point that Dirk made. July was, of course, extremely important because if we had come out of that summit without an agreement, then the consequences for the Union would have been far-reaching, and that's why in the end, despite the tensions that there were during the discussion, I think everyone understood what was at stake and the importance to come out united. There is no sovereignty possible, of course, if there is no unity in the inside. That's stating the obvious. I think the other thing that, of course, we like a lot in the Commission's President's speech is the notion of a geopolitical Europe that, again, goes back to many of the notions that we've been touching about in the presentation today.
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'll go on. So we were just talked about identity, European identity, and there's an interesting question about that one. So Stan asked, so you've argued that the EU should cooperate more closely as a reaction to foreign threats. At the same time, there is extensive criticism also from Europe on USA protectionism. So how do we as Europeans ensure that we don't make European sovereignty into European protectionism?
That's a very important question, and especially in a situation like the COVID crisis, you can sometimes feel the temptation that's clearly there. We talk about making sure that we, for example, on medicine can have our own important production, that we look at supply chains, etc. And then you can quickly come to a point like that. So this exercise is probably an exercise about balance. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Make sure that you do it right and don't, you know, countries like yours and mine, we are global trading nations and France as well, though. I mean, why should we? But on the other hand, we need to learn our lessons from what we experienced in the beginning of that crisis.
I mean, I subscribe to, of course, to what Dirk says. In a sense, we are not here to close up the European Union. I mean, in a way, one of our values is openness, and that has a lot to do with circulation of people and goods and ideas and services. The only thing is that we certainly need to be less naive in the way we approach that and acknowledge that some of our partners might like our openness and not necessarily reciprocate. And that's where we need to have the tools in hand to simply make our case that openness works is a two-way street, and that we are ready to open our economies if we feel we are treated fairly by our partners. And so it's really for the European Union to develop tools and capacities. And again, to go back to the Netherlands, it's extremely interesting to see the Netherlands. It's been in the press developing pretty strong ideas on how to impose a level playing field to external actors within our own market. You all have seen, of course, the Prime Minister's speeches here in Berlin and Zurich. It was Zurich, right? Where he basically touches upon the idea of using the internal market as a leverage on others. So there too, it's really a posture of simply asserting ourselves. We have a large market, we are ready to be open to trade with others, but we are still attached to a certain level of norms, social norms, environmental norms, certainly, and also, of course, the basic principle of reciprocity, which is not, frankly, too much to ask.
Sigrid, there's room for certainly one more question or a couple of bundled questions. Yeah. And you can also pose maybe two at the same time and they answer to two at the same time.
Okay. Okay, so I have one question. Will the pandemic permanently influence the relationship between southern and northwestern states in the EU in the field of economic and financial cooperation? And I'll shoot one after. So after the 2008 economic and financial crisis, Europe emerged out being unequal. What do you think is necessary to avoid the same outcome now?
It emerged unequal, you're saying, and the risk of it.
The example given here was Pablo's question. Spain, for instance. I think the north-southern dichotomy.
Yeah, okay. But the question is, how can we avoid it this time? Okay, I mean, the matter of fact is that, and the answer, the question was by somebody from Spain. The reality is that Spain right now is suffering from it, from the pandemic, as we hear on the news very harshly, especially, if I understand correctly, in Madrid. When we had that debate about the recovery package, I don't have the figures by heart now, but I think it was essentially very much focusing also on the situation in two countries, namely Spain and Italy. So very much in our mind was the situation in these countries. So I think the effort there with the recovery package is exactly to avoid that we are coming back to a situation where it is then unequal or not helping. It was an issue of solidarity. And those who can afford and perhaps less affected coming in to support those who are affected. So I think that essentially was the essence, to avoid that the impact of it is making it even more unequal.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. I would simply add that it's important to keep in mind that we've been through, and we are still in a period, but now, of course, of tension because of the crisis. We are in a different phase after July because now there is this agreement that is extremely ambitious and that we are, of course, we simply need to it's not going to be simple, but that we need to implement. And of course, there are huge opportunities, including from France. The figure is known, but 40 billion out of our 100 billion national recovery package will come from the European funding. So it's pretty big, even for a country like France, which is a net contributor to the European budget. But of course, it's even stronger for Italy or Spain. I think it is, though, important that we keep in mind that it's also our responsibility not to enter in this thing about North and South divide, in the sense that if we go back to identity, I am struck, particularly when I talk to younger people, students, young professionals, I mean the things that frankly bring us together in terms of what are the challenges that we want to overcome as societies, climate change, again, energy transition, how we deal with cultural diversity. I mean, all these issues are frankly the same in all of our societies, and the way and the kind of debates we have are extremely similar. And so the idea that there is this kind of iron divide between North and South, again, certainly because we don't view in France ourselves as a country neither from the south or the north, is in a way a bit artificial. And it's really our responsibility collectively to make sure that we keep focused on what brings us together, which is by all means much larger than the differences we might see. Sometimes it's a bit unfortunate to see such or such publication, I have to say. We had one here in the Netherlands that was pretty disgusting in terms of comparing the values of Northerners or Southerners. It's a way of dealing with things that we should certainly be extremely careful about, I think.
Yes, I think public opinion often portrays these issues as a bit schematic because it makes it easier to talk about them. But at the same time, so also coming back to the populism question, Europe might take a bit more of a lead, I think, so maybe the European Commission is the one to do it, but take a bit more of a lead to try to portray the difficulty of reality and also these, well, I don't want to tie everything together, but the geopolitical aspects of the European Union in this world we live in now. And I think maybe also this Klingendahl enquete, but so this Klingendahl poll also tells us something about whether the Dutch, let's say the general Dutch public, is getting more informed and more aware of these aspects of Europe. I remember 4 years ago, I can tell you as diplomats cannot really say these things, I'm afraid, but when I saw that Trump had won immediately in the morning after, I said, now we are alone, and I meant Europe is on its own now in the world, which is of course a bit of a bold statement, and it didn't come so quickly so far, but there is a tendency in that direction. I think nobody can deny that. And I hope at least, and maybe that this can be a kind of last reflection of you, that we will see awareness of these things overall in Europe be raised a bit, and also this a bit more abstract maybe value that Europe might have for our lives, and indeed what you say, sovereignty, and what is actually sovereignty, that will be contributed to by this new awareness, if it is there. Do you sense something like it growing, and do you indeed place great value in it, or do you think we unfortunately as diplomats have to do it on our own, and the audience will probably not really follow us, but let's hope that we get the liberty to continue doing our good work. Yeah, that's a kind of final question.
It was an analysis put into a question.
Exactly.
Yes, I do sense it, but I would like to add, however, that you know, and I think that's true for Louis as well, both of us to talk a lot to players, let me term it that way, in The Hague, but also in other places. And from time to time, vis-a-vis political parties, I would make an argument to have perhaps an even more stronger or more transparent, open debate on Europe, on the importance of Europe for this country. And sometimes I feel a certain level of shying away from that debate. I will not go into individual parties, you can imagine, But as a general feeling, I think from time to time that there could be even a more forthright and more forceful debate. I know it's difficult, and I've experienced it back home. Actually, we German diplomats have now an obligation from time to time to go home to so-called town hall meetings. And that's always an interesting experience, because then you sit in a certain city and people there will then grill you on Europe, and you have to kind of make sure you land somewhere with your arguments. So you get to know better where people are actually coming from when you engage in these kind of endeavors. And therefore, the real problem, however, is for these debates, usually when you get that invitation out, you reach out to an audience which is willing to engage. So the most difficult part about it is then to also attract people who are opposed and then argue with them. I've been able to do that 2 or 3 times, and that perhaps was even more interesting, also more difficult.
Very shortly, I would say, of course, we need the public opinions. I mean, it's in the sense that Europe's development is so much linked to our own democratic processes that it depends completely on the willingness of people to be on board with that project. Of course, if you're a diplomat, you see in your daily life the benefits you derive from cooperation, not only because you don't kill each other every 20 years, which in itself is, of course, a core and enormous benefit. But of course, because as I said, France or Germany alone discussing a free trade agreement with China, the US, Japan is not exactly the same as bringing on the table and I'm not talking about the Netherlands, it's not the same than bringing on the table a 450 million people's market. So we see the leverage. Or when we do vaccine, we didn't discuss that tonight, but when we pool our resources together to develop, buy a vaccine, of course, our impact is much bigger when we work collectively, or when we do development aid to neighboring regions, where acting collectively, of course, brings us much more impact. So it is in a way obvious to us, and it is understandable that it's not obvious to everyone, because simply it is part of our daily life. It's our jobs in a way, and others have other jobs, and so don't necessarily see it as precisely. One of the things we said that I think is important is that it's really a question also of where your cultural consensus in a way is. You can have a path of saying globalization is frightening, so let's insist on control at the national level. And then you enter in a dialectic where you oppose it to cooperation. And again, we need to make the argument that cooperation is actually a way of keeping leverage and keeping a control of our destiny. I think it's a key issue, the question of this issue of control. It comes always in the debate. Do we control our borders? Do we control trade? Do we control foreign interference, etc.? And by all means, it will work better if we are able to pool resources and forces together. It's something that I think is more and more understood. In a way, the evolution of the world makes the argument easier, and people understand it more and more simply because they see all these forces outside that are pressuring us. And I think it's so obvious that we are better off together than alone, that it enters the public debate. But it's still something that needs to be discussed and shared with everyone.
Interesting, thank you very much.
But this poll by the Klingendahl gave really, in that sense, gave me some optimism, because it means that actually Dutch people reflect more about it than perhaps the own elite thinks. And that is important as a so to say, as an exclaimer. There will be one, Luis went into the issues which are important for us to cooperate on. There will be one important moment the day after tomorrow in Brussels when the Commission will put forward proposals on how to deal with migration. A very difficult and even sometimes toxic issue within the European Union debates. So I really hope that with that we will perhaps be able to turn, not turn the page, we will not be able to turn the page, but make some progress that would be essential also for the mood, for the atmosphere.
Exactly, yeah.
And
well, it's interesting to know that you turn the Brexit slogan around. So take back control is an advertisement for Europe now. That's fascinating.
But don't get, none of us is a friend of Brexit.
No, I know. No. That's not what I meant.
It's a disaster from the first to the end.
It, yeah.
But as this is my last opportunity, let me thank you for inviting us over, and let me thank the students in the audience for their questions. Sometimes it's nice to also hear it in terms of a voice being behind, but we are in different times here now, so thank you for organizing this.
And thank you also for being here and making efforts for this endeavor, which you just called it the open discussion with the large public about Europe. And in fact, you started it by this. And let's hope it will be the beginning of a long series.